The tension in Copper Creek had reached a breaking point by the third day. Despite the security measures put in place, Morrison and his men had proven to be more cunning and persistent than anyone had anticipated. They had been spotted at various locations around town, always staying just out of reach of Sheriff Bradley's patrols, but never far from their intended target. Maggie had spent the previous 2 nights at Dr. Hayes's house, but the constant vigilance required by everyone involved was beginning to take its toll. Frank had transformed the silver dollar into something resembling a fortress with barricaded windows and reinforced doors, but the atmosphere inside was tense rather than safe. Business had dropped off significantly as word of the trouble spread, and several regular customers had chosen to avoid the establishment until the situation was resolved. On this particular evening, Whitmore sat at his usual spot at the bar, nursing a whiskey and keeping a careful eye on the street outside. His man, a grizzled veteran named Samuel Ross, was positioned across the street with a clear view of both the front and side entrances to the saloon. Despite these precautions, Whitmore couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. "You look troubled," Maggie observed as she refilled his glass. "I am troubled," Whitmore admitted. "These men should have made their move by now, or given up and left town. The fact that they're still here, still watching, suggests they have a specific plan." Frank looked up from cleaning glasses behind the bar. "Maybe they're just trying to wear us down, make us drop our guard." "That's possible," Whitmore said. "But I think there's something more. They've had several opportunities to act over the past few days, but they've held back. That suggests they're waiting for the right moment." Sheriff Bradley entered the saloon, his expression grim. "Evening, folks. I'm afraid I have some concerning news." "What now?" Dr. Hayes asked, looking up from his medical journal. "I've had reports that Morrison and his men have been asking questions around town about people's daily routines. Specifically, they've been trying to find out when Miss O'Brien travels between here and the doctor's house." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "How specific were their questions?" "Very specific. They know about the security arrangements, they know about the route you take, and they know about the timing. Someone has been providing them with detailed information." Whitmore's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting we have a spy among us?" "I'm suggesting that these men have been observing us more carefully than we realized. They may not need a spy if they've been watching long enough to learn our patterns." Frank set down the glass he had been cleaning with more force than necessary. "Then, what do we do? Change everything again?" "That might not be enough," Dr. Hayes said quietly. "If they're determined to carry out their revenge, they'll adapt to whatever new arrangements we make." Whitmore stood up from his stool, his decision made. "Then, it's time to stop being reactive and start being proactive." "What do you mean?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "I mean it's time to end this threat permanently." Sheriff Bradley held up a hand. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern, but we can't take the law into our own hands. If we can catch these men in the act of committing a crime, I'll arrest them. But we can't simply hunt them down like animals. Even if those animals are planning to hurt innocent people, even then, that's the difference between justice and vigilantism." Whitmore considered the sheriff's words, but his expression remained resolute. "Sheriff, I respect your position, but there's something you should know about my background. This isn't the first time I've dealt with men who threaten women under my protection." "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that Thomas Whitmore is not just a wealthy rancher. Before I inherited my current position, I was a U.S. Marshal for 8 years. I've tracked down and apprehended dozens of criminals. And I've seen what happens when good people try to follow the rules while dealing with men who have no respect for law or decency." This revelation stunned everyone in the saloon. Sheriff Bradley studied Whitmore with new interest and respect. "You never mentioned that background before. I rarely discuss my previous career unless it becomes relevant. But, in this case, I think my experience gives me insight into how these men think and operate." Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "And what does that experience tell you?" "It tells me that Morrison and his crew are not going to give up. They've invested too much time and effort in this plan, and they've been publicly humiliated. In their minds, their reputation depends on following through with their threats." "So what do you recommend?" Frank asked. Whitmore looked directly at Maggie. "I recommend that we give them what they want." "What?" Maggie exclaimed. You want me to surrender myself to them? Not surrender. I want you to appear to be vulnerable so that they'll finally make their move. But when they do, we'll be ready for them. Sheriff Bradley shook his head. That's an extremely dangerous plan. If something goes wrong, Miss O'Brien could be seriously hurt or killed. If we continue with our current approach, she's going to be hurt or killed anyway, Whitmore replied. At least this way, we control the timing and location of the confrontation. Maggie had been listening to this discussion with growing unease. You want to use me as bait. I want to give you the opportunity to end this threat on your own terms rather than living in fear indefinitely. And if your plan fails, then I'll take full responsibility for the consequences. Dr. Hayes stood up suddenly. This conversation has gone too far. Maggie, you don't have to agree to this. There are other options, such as, Whitmore challenged. She could leave town, start fresh somewhere else where these men can't find her. Running away solves nothing, Maggie said quietly. And besides, this is my home now. I shouldn't have to leave because of 3 bullies. Frank moved closer to the group. What exactly would this plan involve? Whitmore pulled a piece of paper from his jacket and spread it on the bar. It was a crude map of the area between the saloon and Dr. Hayes's house. The route Miss O'Brien takes every night passes by several locations where an ambush could occur. The most likely spot is here, where the path goes through that stand of trees about halfway between the 2 buildings. It's isolated enough that they could grab her without being seen, but close enough to both locations that help could arrive quickly if needed. How quickly? Sheriff Bradley asked. If we position men at these 3 points, Whitmore indicated spots on the map, we could have the entire area surrounded within 30 seconds of the first sign of trouble. And what's to stop them from simply killing her immediately? Dr. Hayes demanded 2 things. First, these men want more than just to kill her. They want to humiliate her the way they feel she humiliated them. That means they'll want to take her somewhere private where they can take their time. Second, they'll be expecting her to be alone and helpless. When they discover she's not, they'll be off balance and confused. Maggie studied the map carefully. How many men would you have in position? Myself, Samuel Ross, Sheriff Bradley if he's willing, and Frank if he's capable with a gun. Frank straightened up. I may be old, but I can still shoot straight when I need to. Sheriff Bradley was clearly torn between his duty to protect Maggie and his reluctance to approve such a risky plan. Miss O'Brien, this is ultimately your decision. But I want you to understand that even with all our preparations, there's no guarantee we can keep you safe if something goes wrong. I understand the risks, Maggie replied. But Mr. Whitmore is right. This situation can't continue indefinitely. If we're going to end it, we need to do it on our terms. Dr. Hayes made one last attempt to dissuade her. Maggie, please reconsider. Is your pride worth risking your life? This isn't about pride, Doctor. It's about refusing to let evil men terrorize innocent people. If I run away now, what happens to the next woman who stands up to men like Morrison? What happens to this community if people learn that criminals can get away with anything as long as they're persistent enough? Her words carried a conviction that silenced further objections. Even Dr. Hayes could see that her mind was made up. When do we do this? She asked. Tomorrow night, Whitmore replied. That gives us time to position everyone properly and make sure all the details are worked out. What about tonight? Frank asked. Tonight, we maintain our current security arrangements. We don't want to tip them off that anything has changed. As the group began discussing the specific details of their plan, none of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the alley across the street and moved silently away from the saloon. Pete had been listening from outside for the past 15 minutes, and he now had exactly the intelligence Morrison needed to turn their enemy's trap into a deadly ambush of their own. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Maggie went about her usual duties at the saloon, but everyone could sense the tension in her movements. Frank busied himself with unnecessary cleaning and organizing, while Dr. Hayes stopped by 3 times to check on her condition and state of mind. Whitmore spent most of the day reviewing the plan with Sheriff Bradley and Samuel Ross. They walked the route multiple times, identifying potential problems and backup positions. By evening, all 3 men were confident that they had covered every contingency. As closing time approached, the saloon emptied out until only the core group remained. Whitmore gathered everyone around the bar for a final review of the plan. Miss O'Brien will leave at exactly 10 o'clock, following her normal route to Dr. Hayes's house. Samuel will be positioned in the trees on the north side of the path. I'll be on the south side, and Sheriff Bradley will follow at a distance of about 50 yards. Frank will remain here, but will be ready to provide backup if needed. What's the signal if something goes wrong? Frank asked. 2 gunshots in rapid succession means abort and retreat. 3 shots means converge on Miss O'Brien's position immediately. Dr. Hayes checked his pocket watch. It's almost time. Maggie took a deep breath and removed her apron. I suppose there's no point in delaying any longer. Whitmore moved to stand beside her. Miss O'Brien, I want you to know that I consider what you're doing to be an act of remarkable courage. Not many people would be willing to face danger head-on in order to protect their community. Let's just hope it works, she replied, though her voice was steadier than she felt. At exactly 10 o'clock, Maggie stepped out of the Silver Dollar and began walking toward Dr. Hayes's house. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see clearly, but also creating deep shadows that could conceal hidden dangers. She forced herself to walk at her normal pace, resisting the urge to hurry or look over her shoulder. Behind her, the carefully planned protection detail moved into position. Whitmore and Ross took their places in the trees on either side of the path, while Sheriff Bradley began following at the predetermined distance. All 3 men were armed and ready to respond at the first sign of trouble. Maggie had covered about half the distance to Dr. Hayes's house when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Her heart began racing, but she maintained her steady pace and tried to appear unaware of the potential threat. Well, what do we have here? Morrison's voice came from directly behind her, much closer than she had expected. She turned to face him and saw that he was not alone. Pete and Jake were flanking him on either side, effectively blocking any escape route. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "You're out rather late." "Not as late as you, sweetheart," Morrison replied with a cruel smile. "Walking all alone in the dark like this is dangerous. A lady shouldn't travel without proper protection. I'm perfectly safe, thank you." Jake laughed harshly. "Not anymore, you're not. You see, we've been planning this little meeting for days, and we're finally going to have that private conversation you've been avoiding." Maggie glanced quickly toward the trees where Whitmore and Ross were supposed to be hidden, but she could see no sign of them. She also couldn't see Sheriff Bradley, though he should have been within sight by now. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, beginning to back away from the 3 men. "I don't have anything to say to any of you." "Oh, but we have plenty to say to you," Pete said, moving to cut off her retreat. "We're going to teach you some manners, starting with how to show proper respect to your betters." Morrison pulled out a length of rope from his coat. "First, we're going to tie you up nice and tight. Then, we're going to take you somewhere quiet where we can take our time with your education." It was at this moment that Maggie realized something had gone terribly wrong with the plan. Her protectors should have intervened by now, but there was no sign of help coming. She was truly on her own. "You're making a mistake," she said, continuing to back away. "There are people who know where I am and when I should arrive. If I don't show up on time, they'll come looking for me." "Let them look," Morrison said. "By the time they find anything, it'll be too late to matter." Jake moved suddenly, grabbing for Maggie's arm, but she was ready for him. She dodged to the side and ran toward the trees, hoping to find Whitmore or Ross. Instead, she stumbled into the arms of a 4th man she hadn't seen before. "Going somewhere, lady?" the stranger asked, holding her firmly while she struggled. Maggie's heart sank as she realized the full extent of their situation. Morrison and his crew had not only anticipated the ambush, they had turned it against her protectors. The question now was whether Whitmore and the others were dead, captured, or simply outmaneuvered. "Bring her over here, Charlie," Morrison called to the 4th man. "Time to get started." As Charlie dragged her back toward the group, Maggie heard a sound that gave her the first hope she'd felt in several minutes. It was the distinctive whistle that Dr. Hayes used to call his dog, but she knew the doctor didn't have a dog. It was obviously a signal. Morrison heard it too and looked around suspiciously. "What was that?" "Sounded like some kind of bird," Pete said dismissively. Birds don't whistle like that at night, Jake pointed out. Before anyone could investigate further, the night erupted in chaos. Gunfire blazed from multiple directions, and all 3 lanterns that Charlie had been carrying to provide light were shattered simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, Charlie's grip on Maggie loosened, and she pulled free. "Get down!" Whitmore's voice shouted from somewhere in the darkness. "Everyone get down." Maggie dropped to the ground as bullets whistled over her head. She could hear Morrison cursing and shouting orders to his men. But, in the confusion of darkness and gunfire, nobody seemed to know where anyone else was located. "This way," Ross's voice called from her left. Miss O'Brien, move toward my voice. She began crawling in the direction of the voice, staying as low as possible while gunfire continued to echo around her. Behind her, she could hear Morrison rallying his men for a counterattack. "They can't have many men," Morrison shouted. "Spread out and find them." But Morrison had underestimated both the number and the skill of his opponents. Whitmore had not simply positioned 3 men around the ambush site. He had brought his entire security team, 6 experienced fighters who had been carefully concealed in the surrounding area. The battle was brief, but intense. Morrison's crew had the advantage of desperation, but Whitmore's men had the advantage of training and preparation. When the gunfire finally stopped, 3 of the 4 attackers were wounded and all were captured. Sheriff Bradley emerged from the shadows with Pete in custody. "Everyone all right?" "Miss O'Brien is safe," Ross reported. "Morrison has a bullet in his shoulder, Jake has a flesh wound in his leg, and Charlie appears to be unharmed but unconscious." Whitmore appeared beside Maggie and helped her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" "No, just shaken," she replied. "I thought the plan had failed when they grabbed me." "The plan worked exactly as intended. We knew they had been watching us, so we fed them information we wanted them to have, while keeping our real preparations secret." "You mean you expected them to have overheard our conversation?" "We were counting on it. The positions we discussed last night were decoys. Our real positions allowed us to surround them completely when they moved to grab you." Dr. Hayes arrived with Frank and several other townspeople who had heard the gunfire. "Is everyone safe?" "Everyone who matters," Sheriff Bradley replied grimly. "These 4 gentlemen are going to be spending a long time in jail, assuming they live long enough to stand trial." Morrison, who was sitting on the ground holding his wounded shoulder, looked up at Maggie with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over, you little dash." His words were cut off when Whitmore's boot connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. "Actually, it is over," Whitmore said calmly. "You see, Mr. Morrison, you made the mistake of threatening someone under the protection of Thomas Whitmore. That's not something people do twice." As Sheriff Bradley and his deputies led the prisoners away, Maggie found herself alone with Whitmore for the first time since the crisis had begun. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life. You saved your own life by having the courage to face this threat directly. All I did was provide some tactical support." "There's something I need to ask you," Maggie said hesitantly. "Go ahead." "Back at the saloon, you mentioned that you've dealt with men who threaten women under your protection. Was I really under your protection, or was there another reason you were so determined to help me?" Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the stars. "May I ask you a question first?" "Of course." "The man I told you I was searching for, Jacob Hartwell. Did you really not recognize the name or description?" Maggie felt a chill of apprehension. "Should I have?" "Jacob Hartwell was my younger brother. He didn't embezzle money from our business. He was murdered by a man who did embezzle the money and then disappeared. I've been hunting that man for 2 years." "I'm sorry for your loss," Maggie said, though she sensed there was more to the story. "The man who killed my brother also attacked a young woman who worked in our office. She tried to stop him from stealing the money, and he hurt her very badly before escaping. She survived, but she was never the same afterward." Understanding began to dawn on Maggie. "And when you saw Morrison threatening me, I saw my brother's killer threatening another innocent woman. I couldn't let that happen again, even if you were a complete stranger." "But I'm not a complete stranger, am I?" Whitmore looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean? Your brother's killer. You said he was well-educated and charming, with brown hair and a scar on his left hand. You said he would probably be using an assumed name." "Yes. Do you know something about him?" Maggie took a deep breath. Mr. Whitmore, my real name isn't Margaret O'Brien. It's Margaret Hartwell. Jacob was my husband. The revelation hit Whitmore like a physical blow. He stared at her in shock, trying to process this unexpected connection. That's impossible, he said finally. Jacob never mentioned being married. We were married in secret just a few weeks before he was killed. He said he wanted to wait until your family business was more established before making the announcement. He was planning to tell you the day after it happened. Whitmore sat down heavily on a nearby rock. You're Jacob's wife. You're the woman I've been searching for. You've been searching for me? When I couldn't find the killer, I hoped I could at least locate Jacob's wife and make sure she was provided for. But there was no record of the marriage, and nobody seemed to know where you had gone. I was afraid, Maggie admitted. After Jacob was killed and the money was stolen, there were people who suspected I might have been involved. I changed my name and came west to start over. And the real killer? I never knew his true identity. Jacob called him Marcus, but that might not have been his real name. He was someone Jacob trusted, which made the betrayal even worse. They sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to absorb the implications of this revelation. Miss O'Brien, Mrs. Hartwell, I don't know what to call you now. Maggie is fine. It's been my name for so long that it feels more real than my legal name. Maggie, then, I want you to know that I consider you to be family. Jacob's widow is my sister-in-law, and that makes you my responsibility. I don't need to be anyone's responsibility, Maggie said firmly. I've been taking care of myself quite well. I can see that. But what I mean is that you don't have to take care of yourself alone anymore. If you'll accept it, I'd like to offer you a place in my family and a share in the business that Jacob helped build. Maggie considered this offer carefully. What about my life here in Copper Creek? I have friends, responsibilities, a job I enjoy. You could keep all of that if you wanted to. Or you could come back east and help me run the ranch operations. Or you could do something entirely different. The choice would be yours. And the man who killed Jacob? I'll keep searching for him. But now I have someone who actually knew him, who can provide details that might help track him down. Dr. Hayes appeared beside them, interrupting their conversation. I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to make sure you're both all right. That was quite an ordeal. We're fine, Doctor, Maggie replied. Just processing some unexpected developments. Frank and Ross joined them, along with Sheriff Bradley, who had finished securing the prisoners. It's over, Bradley announced. All 4 men are in custody, and they'll be transferred to the territorial prison as soon as their wounds are treated. You won't be seeing them again. What about the cattle drive? Frank asked. Are there going to be any repercussions from the trail boss? I spoke with him earlier, Bradley replied. He's actually grateful that we dealt with the problem. Apparently, Morrison and his crew have been trouble for the entire drive. He's happy to be rid of them. As the group prepared to return to town, Maggie realized that her life was about to change dramatically once again. She had found safety and community in Copper Creek, but she had also found family in Thomas Whitmore. The challenge now would be determining how to honor both connections. Mr. Whitmore, she said as they walked back toward the silver dollar. I'd like to accept your offer, but with some modifications. I'm listening. I'd like to spend part of my time helping you search for Jacob's killer and part of my time here in Copper Creek. This town gave me a home when I needed one, and these people risked their lives to protect me. I can't simply abandon them. Whitmore smiled for the first time since learning her true identity. I think that's an excellent compromise, and I think Jacob would approve. As they reached the main street of Copper Creek, Maggie looked around at the town that had become her sanctuary and then at the man who had become her protector and family. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt truly safe and truly at home. The threat that had brought them together was over, but the relationship that had developed in response to that threat was just beginning. Thomas Whitmore had found the family he had been searching for, and Maggie had found the security and belonging she had been seeking. In the end, the 3 cowboys who had tried to terrorize a saloon girl had inadvertently brought together 2 people who needed each other more than either of them had realized. Their attempt at revenge had backfired spectacularly, creating instead a bond that would last for the rest of their lives. The morning sun brought no relief to the tension that had settled over Copper Creek like a heavy blanket. Maggie O'Brien had slept poorly her dreams filled with visions of rough hands and threatening voices. She rose early, as was her habit, and prepared for another day at the Silver Dollar. The events of the previous evening weighed on her mind, but she was determined not to let fear control her actions. Downstairs in the saloon, Frank Sullivan was already at work, sweeping the floor and arranging chairs around the tables. He looked up as Maggie descended the stairs, his weathered face creased with concern. "Good morning, dear. How did you sleep?" "Well enough," Maggie replied, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "Any sign of our unwelcome visitors from last night?" "Not that I've seen. I took a walk around town earlier, and there's no sign of them at the main camp where the cattle drive is staying. Could be they moved on like everyone hoped." Maggie tied her apron around her waist and began helping with the morning preparations. "Somehow I doubt we'll be that fortunate." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Samuel Hayes, one of their regular customers who typically stopped by for coffee and breakfast before beginning his rounds. Dr. Hayes was a kind man in his 50s who had come west to escape some tragedy in his past. He had become something of a father figure to Maggie over the years. "Good morning, Maggie, Frank," he said, settling into his usual seat near the window. "I heard there was some excitement here last night." "News travels fast in a small town," Frank observed, bringing the doctor his coffee. "Is it true that Thomas Whitmore intervened in some kind of altercation?" Dr. Hayes asked, looking concerned. Maggie nodded as she set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. 3 cowboys from the cattle drive were being persistent in their attention. "Mr. Whitmore encouraged them to leave." "Encouraged is a polite way to put it," Frank added. "The man's got quite a reputation." Those 3 tough guys turned white as sheets when they heard his name. Dr. Hayes frowned. "I've heard stories about Thomas Whitmore. He's supposed to be one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, but there are rumors about his methods. Some say he's not above using violence to protect his interests." "Well, whatever his methods, I'm grateful he was here," Maggie said. "Those men weren't going to take no for an answer." "You should be careful, Maggie," Dr. Hayes warned. "Men like that often hold grudges. Just because they haven't been seen this morning doesn't mean they've left town." As if summoned by his words, the saloon door swung open and Thomas Whitmore entered. He was dressed impeccably despite the early hour, and he moved with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. He nodded politely to the assembled group before approaching the bar. "Good morning, Miss O'Brien, Mr. Sullivan. I trust you had a peaceful night." "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Maggie replied. "Yes, thankfully it was quiet. May I get you some coffee?" "That would be excellent, thank you." Whitmore accepted the cup she offered and took an appreciative sip. "I've been making inquiries around town this morning. It seems our friends from last night have not yet departed with their cattle drive." Frank looked up sharply from wiping down tables. "They're still in town? According to the trail boss, they requested permission to stay behind for an extra day. Claimed they wanted to resupply and rest their horses. Of course, that could be legitimate, but you don't think it is," Maggie finished. "I think it would be wise to remain cautious. Men who have been publicly humiliated don't often simply forget and move on." Dr. Hayes had been listening to the conversation with growing concern. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Dr. Samuel Hayes." "A pleasure, Doctor." Whitmore shook the offered hand. "I understand you're the local physician." "That's correct. And I share your concern about these men. I've treated my share of victims of frontier violence, and I'd prefer not to add Miss O'Brien to that list." Maggie felt a flash of irritation at being discussed, as if she weren't present. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I've been doing so for 23 years. "No one doubts your capability," Whitmore said gently. "But capability and wisdom sometimes require accepting help when it's offered." Before Maggie could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley. Bradley was a competent lawman in his 40s who had managed to keep the peace in Copper Creek through a combination of fair dealing and judicious use of force when necessary. His presence in the saloon at this early hour suggested he had heard about the previous night's incident. "Morning, folks," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes?" "Of course, Sheriff," Frank replied. "Coffee?" "Don't mind if I do." Bradley accepted a cup and settled into a chair near the group. I suppose you can guess why I'm here. Word travels fast, Maggie observed. It does indeed. I heard there was some trouble last night involving some cowboys and a certain wealthy gentleman. He nodded respectfully to Whitmore. I wanted to make sure everyone was all right, and to let you know that I'm keeping an eye on the situation. That's reassuring, Sheriff, Dr. Hayes said. We were just discussing the fact that the 3 men involved apparently haven't left town with their cattle drive. Bradley's expression grew more serious. I'm aware of that. I spoke with the trail boss early this morning. He confirmed that 3 of his men requested permission to stay behind. He wasn't happy about it, but they're not technically under his authority once they're off duty. Have you spoken with the men themselves? Whitmore asked. I tried to, but they weren't at any of the places I expected to find them. Not at the main camp, not at the hotel, not at any of the other saloons. It's possible they left town on their own, but you don't think so, Maggie said. Let's just say I'm not taking any chances. I'll be making extra rounds today, and I've asked some of the more reliable citizens to keep their eyes open. Whitmore set down his coffee cup. Sheriff, what exactly are the legal options if these men cause further trouble? Well, if they commit an actual crime, I can arrest them. But just staying in town isn't illegal, even if their motives are questionable. The problem is that men like this are usually smart enough to avoid breaking the law in ways that can be proven. What about harassment? Threatening behavior? Dr. Hayes asked. Hard to prove unless there are multiple reliable witnesses. And, even then, the penalties are usually minor, a night in jail and a small fine. Maggie had been listening to this discussion with growing frustration. So essentially, we have to wait for them to actually do something before any action can be taken. I'm afraid that's the reality of frontier law, Bradley admitted. Prevention is usually more effective than prosecution out here. Which brings us back to the question of protection, Whitmore said. Miss O'Brien, I meant what I said last night about being available if you need help. I'm staying at the hotel indefinitely, and I can be reached at any hour. Mr. Whitmore, while I appreciate your offer, I can't help but wonder what you expect in return. In my experience, men don't usually offer help to women without expecting some form of compensation. Whitmore's expression grew serious. I understand your skepticism. You're right to be cautious about the motives of men you don't know well. But I give you my word that I expect nothing in return for my assistance except the satisfaction of knowing that a decent person is safe from harm. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. If I may ask, Mr. Whitmore, what is it that brings you to Copper Creek? It's somewhat off the usual routes for men of your status. I'm investigating some business opportunities in the region, Whitmore replied. And I'm also searching for someone. A man who disappeared several months ago after. Let's call it a business disagreement. What kind of business disagreement? Sheriff Bradley asked, his lawman's instincts clearly engaged. Whitmore hesitated for a moment before answering. The man in question, Jacob Hartwell, was my business partner in a cattle operation. He embezzled a substantial amount of money and disappeared, leaving several families destitute. I have reason to believe he may have come west and assumed a false identity. That's quite serious, Bradley said. Have you contacted other law enforcement agencies? I've hired private investigators and consulted with federal marshals, but Hartwell seems to have covered his tracks well. I decided to take a personal hand in the search. Maggie studied Whitmore's face as he spoke. There was something in his expression that suggested the story was more complicated than he was revealing, but she couldn't determine what he might be hiding. This man Hartwell, she said, what does he look like? Perhaps someone in town has seen him. Medium height, brown hair, clean-shaven when I last saw him, though he may have grown a beard. He has a distinctive scar on his left hand from an old accident. He's well-educated and charming, the kind of man who makes friends easily. Dr. Hayes, Frank, and Sheriff Bradley all shook their heads. Doesn't sound familiar, Bradley said. But I'll keep the description in mind. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from somewhere outside. Everyone in the saloon froze, listening intently. That came from the general store, Frank said, moving toward the window. Sheriff Bradley was already on his feet, his hand resting on his gun. I'd better investigate. Everyone stay here until I get back. As Bradley left the saloon, Whitmore moved to stand near Maggie. Miss O'Brien, I think it would be wise for you to remain inside today. This could be the beginning of the trouble we've been expecting. I can't hide in the saloon all day, Maggie protested. I have errands to run, and Frank needs supplies from the general store. I'll take care of the supplies, Frank said immediately. Maggie, Mr. Whitmore is right. There's no sense taking unnecessary risks. Before Maggie could argue further, Sheriff Bradley returned with grim news. Someone threw a rock through the window of Peterson's general store. There was a note tied to it. What did it say? Dr. Hayes asked. Bradley held up a piece of paper. It's addressed to the fancy saloon girl who thinks she's too good for honest cowboys. Maggie felt her blood run cold. What else does it say? It says that some lessons need to be taught in private, away from interference. It suggests that you might want to be more careful about where you go and when. Whitmore's jaw tightened. This has gone beyond harassment. This is a direct threat. I agree, Bradley said. Miss O'Brien, I strongly recommend that you don't venture out alone until we locate these men. This is ridiculous, Maggie said, though her voice betrayed her growing fear. They're trying to terrorize me into submission. And they're succeeding, Dr. Hayes observed gently. Which means their strategy is working. Whitmore moved closer to Maggie, his voice low and intense. Listen to me carefully. These men are not going to be satisfied with just scaring you. They want revenge, and they'll escalate their actions until they get it. You cannot face them alone. Then, what do you suggest? Maggie asked. That I cower in the saloon indefinitely? I suggest that you accept protection until the threat is neutralized. From you. From me. From Sheriff Bradley. From anyone who can keep you safe. Pride is a luxury you can't afford right now. Frank had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Maggie, I think Mr. Whitmore is right. These aren't just drunken cowboys anymore. They're criminals who are planning to hurt you. We need to take this seriously. Sheriff Bradley nodded in agreement. I'm going to organize a search for these men. But, in a town this size, there are too many places to hide. Miss O'Brien, I recommend that you stay in public places with plenty of people around, and that you don't go anywhere alone. What about the saloon? Maggie asked. We can't close during the day. That's when we make most of our money. The saloon should be safe as long as there are customers around, Whitmore said. But after closing time. I've been thinking about that, Frank said. My nephew Jake lives just outside town. Maybe Maggie could stay with his family until this blows over. Absolutely not, Maggie said firmly. I won't bring danger to innocent people, especially children. Then, what do you propose? Dr. Hayes asked. Before Maggie could answer, they heard the sound of horses approaching at high speed. Through the window, they could see 3 riders galloping past the saloon toward the outskirts of town. Was that them? Frank asked. Whitmore had moved to get a better view. I couldn't see clearly, but it's possible. Sheriff, are you going to follow them? I'll try. But they have a head start, and they know I'm looking for them. If they're smart, they'll keep moving and put some distance between themselves and town. And if they're not smart? Maggie asked. Then, they'll circle back after dark and try to finish what they started. The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the room understood that the situation had moved beyond mere harassment into genuine danger. Miss O'Brien, Whitmore said, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. I'm staying at the hotel, but, as you know, it's not exactly a fortress. However, I also have a camp set up about 5 miles outside town where my men are stationed. It's secure, well-guarded, and completely isolated from the main roads. You want me to hide out at your camp? I want you to stay somewhere safe while we deal with this problem permanently. Maggie considered the offer, but something about it made her uncomfortable. What men? You never mentioned having men with you. I travel with security when I'm conducting business in unfamiliar territory. For experienced men who are quite capable of ensuring your safety. And what would be expected of me in return for this protection? Whitmore's expression grew cold. Miss O'Brien, I understand your caution, but I find the implication of your question insulting. I am offering you sanctuary, nothing more. Dr. Hayes stepped forward. Perhaps there's another solution. My house has a spare room, and it's close enough to town that Sheriff Bradley could check on us regularly. That's kind of you, Doctor, Maggie said. But I still don't want to put anyone else at risk. The risk is minimal, Dr. Hayes insisted. These men are focused on you, not on random citizens who help you. Frank had been thinking during this exchange. What if we all work together? Dr. Hayes could provide shelter during the night. Mr. Whitmore could provide protection during the day, and I could modify the saloon to make it more secure. How would you modify the saloon? Sheriff Bradley asked. Bar the windows, reinforce the doors, maybe even add a back exit in case we need to get out quickly. It wouldn't take much to make this place defensible. Whitmore nodded approvingly. That's a sound plan. And I could station one of my men nearby to keep watch during operating hours. Wait, Maggie said, holding up her hand. All of you are making plans for my life without asking what I want. I appreciate your concern, but I need to be part of these decisions. The men looked at each other, realizing she was right. You're absolutely correct, Whitmore said. What do you want to do? Maggie took a deep breath, considering her options. I want to continue working and living my life, but I also want to be safe. Dr. Hayes's offer of shelter is generous, and I'll accept it gratefully. Frank's security modifications make sense. And, Mr. Whitmore, if you're serious about providing protection without expecting anything in return, then I'll accept that as well. I am completely serious, Whitmore assured her. Then, we have a plan, Sheriff Bradley said. But I want everyone to understand that this is a temporary solution. Eventually, we need to deal with these men directly, either by arresting them or by convincing them to leave the territory. What if they don't leave? Frank asked. Then, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Bradley replied, though his tone suggested he had some ideas about how such a situation might be resolved. As the group began discussing the details of their plan, none of them noticed the figure watching from the alley across the street. Pete had circled back on foot after the dramatic horse chase, and he had been listening to their conversation through the open window. Now he had valuable information about their security arrangements. Morrison and Jake were waiting at an abandoned mine shaft several miles from town, and Pete knew they would be very interested to learn about Dr. Hayes's house and the planned modifications to the saloon. The three men had no intention of giving up their quest for revenge, and now they had the intelligence they needed to strike when their target was most vulnerable. The battle lines were being drawn in Copper Creek, and both sides were preparing for a confrontation that would test everyone's resolve. Maggie O'Brien had unwittingly become the center of a conflict that would determine not just her own fate, but the character of the community that had become her home. As the day progressed, the preparations began in earnest. Frank started boarding up windows while Dr. Hayes prepared his spare room. Whitmore dispatched one of his men to begin surveillance, and Sheriff Bradley organized a citizen patrol to supplement his own efforts. But, despite all their precautions, they were already one step behind their enemies. Pete's intelligence gathering had given Morrison and his crew a significant advantage, and they intended to use it before their opposition could become fully prepared. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either end the threat permanently or escalate it beyond anything the peaceful town of Copper Creek had ever experienced. The evening sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Creek, a small frontier town that had sprung up around a silver mine. The sound of piano music and laughter drifted from the Silver Dollar Saloon, the largest and most popular establishment in town. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of whiskey, while oil lamps cast a warm glow over the wooden tables where men played cards and shared stories of their day's work. Behind the bar, polishing glasses with practiced efficiency, stood Margaret Maggie O'Brien. At 23, she had the kind of beauty that could stop conversations when she entered a room. Her auburn hair was pinned up in an elegant style, and her emerald green dress, though modest by saloon standards, complemented her striking green eyes. But it wasn't just her looks that made Maggie special. She possessed a sharp wit and genuine kindness that had earned the respect of most of the town's residents. Maggie had arrived in Copper Creek 2 years earlier, fleeing a difficult situation back east. She had taken the job at the Silver Dollar out of necessity, but, over time, she had proven herself to be much more than just another saloon girl. She could handle rowdy customers with a combination of charm and firmness. She knew how to listen when miners needed someone to talk to about their troubles, and she had a way of making everyone feel welcome. The saloon's owner, an elderly man named Frank Sullivan, had come to rely on her completely. On this particular evening, the saloon was busier than usual. Word had spread that a cattle drive was passing through town, bringing dozens of cowboys who were eager to spend their hard-earned money on drinks and entertainment. Maggie moved gracefully between the tables, serving whiskey and beer while deflecting the occasional inappropriate comment with a smile and a quick comeback that usually left the offender laughing rather than offended. At a corner table sat three men who had been watching Maggie's every move for the past hour. They were part of the cattle drive crew, led by a man named Buck Morrison. Morrison was a large, intimidating figure with weathered features and cold blue eyes. He had a reputation for being rough with women, and the two men with him, Pete and Jake, were cut from the same cloth. They had been drinking heavily since arriving in town, and their attention had become increasingly focused on Maggie. "Hey, sweetheart," Morrison called out as Maggie passed their table. "How about you come sit with us for a while? We've got money to spend." Maggie paused and turned to face them with her professional smile. "I appreciate the offer, gentlemen, but I'm working right now. Can I get you another round of drinks?" Morrison's expression darkened. "I wasn't asking, darling. I was telling. We've been traveling for weeks, and we deserve some proper entertainment. The entertainment here is the piano music and good conversation," Maggie replied calmly. "If you're looking for something else, you might want to try the next town over." Pete, a thin man with a scraggly beard, laughed harshly. "She's got some spirit, Buck. I like that in a woman." "Me too," Morrison said, standing up slowly. His considerable height allowed him to tower over Maggie as he took a step closer. "But I like obedience even more." The conversation at nearby tables had begun to quiet down as other patrons noticed the tension building. Frank Sullivan, who had been counting money behind the bar, looked up with concern. At 72 years old, Frank was in no condition to physically confront three younger men, but his loyalty to Maggie was absolute. "Gentlemen," Frank called out, his voice carrying across the room, "Miss O'Brien is here to serve drinks, not to provide any other kind of company. I'd appreciate it if you'd treat her with respect." Morrison turned his attention to the elderly saloon owner. "Old man, you'd better mind your own business unless you want trouble." "This is my establishment," Frank replied firmly. "Everything that happens here is my business." Jake, the third member of Morrison's group, decided to add his voice to the confrontation. "Maybe we should teach both of them some manners, Buck." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Several of the other customers had stopped their conversations entirely, and the piano player had reduced his volume to barely audible. Everyone in the saloon could sense that the situation was about to escalate beyond mere words. Maggie had faced difficult customers before, but there was something different about these three men. She could see the genuine menace in their eyes, and she knew that her usual tactics of humor and deflection weren't going to work. Still, she refused to show fear. "I think you gentlemen have had enough to drink for one evening," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Perhaps you should return to your camp and get some rest." Morrison reached out and grabbed Maggie's wrist before she could step away. His grip was tight enough to cause pain, and she couldn't help but wince. "Let go of me," she said, her voice now carrying a sharp edge. "Or what?" Morrison asked with a cruel smile. "You'll call for help? Look around, sweetheart. Nobody in here is going to stand up to us." Unfortunately, Morrison's assessment of the situation was largely accurate. The Silver Dollars customers that evening consisted mainly of miners and local businessmen, decent people, but not fighters. They had families to think about and couldn't afford to get involved in a confrontation with dangerous strangers who would be moving on in a day or two. Frank began moving around the bar, his hands shaking slightly with age and anger. "I said let her go." Pete intercepted the elderly man before he could reach Maggie. "Sit back down, Grandpa, before you get hurt." As the confrontation intensified, none of them noticed the tall figure who had quietly entered the saloon. He stood just inside the doorway, taking in the scene with calm, observant eyes. The stranger was well-dressed in a way that suggested wealth. His clothes were clean and well-tailored. His boots were made of fine leather, and his hat was the kind that cost more than most men in Copper Creek earned in a month. But there was something about his presence that suggested he was far from being just another wealthy Easterner playing at being a cowboy. Morrison tightened his grip on Maggie's wrist and pulled her closer. I think it's time you and I had a private conversation upstairs. There are no rooms upstairs, Maggie replied through gritted teeth. This isn't that kind of establishment. Then, we'll make other arrangements, Morrison said. Pete, Jake, let's take the lady for a walk outside. It was at this moment that the stranger's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I believe the lady asked you to let her go. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. The stranger had moved closer, though no one had heard his footsteps. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. His expression was calm, almost relaxed, but there was something about his bearing that commanded attention. Morrison looked the newcomer up and down with obvious disdain. This doesn't concern you, fancy man. Keep walking. The stranger smiled, but it was not a warm expression. Actually, it does concern me. You see, I have a particular dislike for men who mistreat women. Jake laughed. What are you going to do about it, city boy? Buy us off with your daddy's money. Something like that, the stranger replied. He reached into his jacket, and for a moment Morrison and his men tensed, expecting him to draw a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a leather wallet and extracted a business card, which he handed to Morrison. Morrison glanced at the card, and his expression changed immediately. The color drained from his face, and his grip on Maggie's wrist loosened involuntarily. That's right, the stranger said quietly. I'm Thomas Whitmore. Perhaps you've heard of me. Pete and Jake crowded around Morrison to look at the card, and their reactions were similar to their leaders. The name Thomas Whitmore was indeed familiar to anyone involved in the cattle business. He was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, owning vast spreads across 3 states. But, more importantly, he had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless with anyone who crossed him or threatened his interests. Mr. Whitmore, Morrison stammered, finally, releasing Maggie's wrist completely. I didn't know, we weren't aware. Whitmore retrieved his business card and returned it to his wallet. Of course you weren't. But now you are. And now you understand that this young lady is under my protection. Maggie looked at the stranger with confusion. She had never seen him before in her life, and she certainly wasn't under anyone's protection. But she was grateful for the intervention, even if she didn't understand it. There's been a misunderstanding, Morrison said, backing away from Maggie. We were just having a friendly conversation. Is that what you call it? Whitmore asked, grabbing a woman against her will and threatening to take her outside? I must have a different definition of friendly conversation. The 3 cowboys exchanged nervous glances. They had heard stories about Thomas Whitmore's methods of dealing with problems. He had the money and connections to destroy a man's livelihood, and he wasn't afraid to use less civilized means when necessary. We'll just be going now, Morrison said, gesturing for his companions to follow him toward the door. An excellent idea, Whitmore agreed. But before you leave, I think you owe the lady an apology. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he knew he was in no position to refuse. Sorry, miss, he muttered without looking at Maggie. I'm afraid that wasn't quite sincere enough, Whitmore said. Try again. This time Morrison looked directly at Maggie, and she could see the humiliation and anger burning in his eyes. I apologize for my behavior, Miss O'Brien. It was inappropriate. Thank you, Maggie replied, though she felt no satisfaction in the forced apology. After the 3 men had left the saloon, the normal sounds of conversation and music gradually resumed. Frank hurried over to check on Maggie, while Whitmore moved to the bar and ordered a whiskey. Are you all right, dear? Frank asked, his voice full of concern. I'm fine, Maggie assured him, though her wrist was still tender where Morrison had grabbed her. Thank you for standing up for me. Frank waved off her thanks. I should have done more. I'm too old to be much help in a situation like that. Maggie approached the bar where Whitmore was nursing his drink. Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to thank you for your intervention. I'm not sure how that situation would have ended without your help. Whitmore looked up from his glass. You handled yourself well. You didn't show fear, even when you had every reason to be afraid. I was afraid, Maggie admitted. But I've learned that showing fear only makes men like that more aggressive. A wise observation. You're clearly more than capable of taking care of yourself under normal circumstances. Then, why did you say I was under your protection? Maggie asked directly. Whitmore smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm. Because sometimes the truth is less important than the effect it creates. Those men needed to believe that harming you would have serious consequences. My reputation provided that belief. But why did you help me at all? You don't know me. Whitmore considered the question for a moment before answering. Let's just say I have personal reasons for disliking men who abuse their physical advantages over women. And, from what I observed, you're someone worth helping. Frank approached them with a bottle of his best whiskey. Mr. Whitmore, this drink is on the house. It's the least I can do to thank you for what you did. That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan. Frank Sullivan. I own this place. Well, Mr. Sullivan, you have a fine establishment here. And you're fortunate to have Miss O'Brien working for you. She's clearly an asset to your business. That she is, Frank agreed. Maggie's the best employee I've ever had. Smart, capable, and decent to everyone who deserves it. As the evening progressed, Whitmore remained at the bar, occasionally engaging in conversation with Maggie when her duties allowed. She found him to be surprisingly easy to talk to, despite his obvious wealth and status. He asked about her life in Copper Creek, showed genuine interest in her opinions on various topics, and demonstrated a sense of humor that was both sophisticated and accessible. If you don't mind my asking, Maggie said during a brief lull in customers, what brings you to Copper Creek? This isn't exactly on the main travel routes. I'm considering purchasing some land in the area, Whitmore replied. There are opportunities for expansion here, and I like to personally evaluate any potential investments. The silver mine, among other things. I'm interested in the long-term prospects for this region. Mining towns can be boom or bust, but some of them evolve into stable communities. I think Copper Creek might be one of the latter. Maggie was impressed by his analytical approach to business. What makes you think so? Several factors. The mine seems to have substantial reserves, which means it's likely to operate for many years. The town has developed basic infrastructure, a bank, a general store, a doctor, a church. And, most importantly, it has the right kind of people. Hardworking, honest folks who are building something lasting rather than just looking to get rich quick and move on. You can tell all that from one evening in a saloon. Whitmore chuckled. I've been in town for 3 days, observing and asking questions. This is just my first visit to the Silver Dollar. And what's your assessment of our establishment? Favorable, he said, looking directly at her. Very favorable. As the night grew later, the crowd in the saloon began to thin out. The miners had early shifts the next morning, and the local businessmen had families waiting at home. By 11 o'clock, only a handful of customers remained, including Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, Frank called from behind the bar, we'll be closing in about an hour if you're planning to head back to the hotel. Actually, I was wondering if you might have a room available here. The hotel is comfortable enough, but I prefer the atmosphere of a working establishment. Frank looked apologetic. I'm sorry, but we don't have guest rooms. This is just a saloon and restaurant. What about the space upstairs? Whitmore asked. I noticed there's a second floor. That's just storage and Maggie's living quarters, Frank explained. She has a small apartment up there. Whitmore turned to Maggie with a respectful expression. Miss O'Brien, I hope you don't think I was prying into your living arrangements. I was simply looking for an alternative to the hotel. No offense taken, Maggie replied. But Frank's right. There's only one small room up there, and it's barely big enough for me. I understand. I'll return to the hotel then. As Whitmore prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Miss O'Brien, if those men from tonight cause any further trouble, please don't hesitate to send word to me at the Copper Creek Hotel. I meant what I said about protection. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I appreciate the offer, but I'm sure they'll be moving on with their cattle drive first thing in the morning. I hope you're right. But sometimes men like that don't forget perceived slights as easily as we might wish. After Whitmore had gone, Maggie and Frank finished cleaning up the saloon in companionable silence. It had been an eventful evening, and both of them were processing what had happened. That Mr. Whitmore seems like a decent man, Frank observed as he locked the cash drawer. He does, Maggie agreed. Though there was something about him. I can't quite put my finger on it. What do you mean? He was very polite and respectful, but there was something dangerous underneath. Did you see how quickly those cowboys backed down when they heard his name? Frank nodded. Rich men don't get that kind of reaction just from having money. There must be more to his reputation than business success. Exactly. And the way he handled the whole situation, it was like he'd done something similar many times before. Well, whatever his methods, I'm grateful he was here tonight. Those three could have caused serious trouble. Maggie touched her wrist where Morrison had grabbed her. They still might. Mr. Whitmore was right. Men like that don't forget easily. Do you think they'll come back? I hope not. But if they do, I'll be ready for them. Frank looked at her with concern. Maggie, you can't handle three violent men on your own. Maybe we should consider closing early for the next few nights, just until we're sure they've moved on. Frank, we can't let bullies dictate how we run our business. If we close early because we're afraid, we're giving them exactly what they want. But your safety is more important than a few dollars in revenue. Maggie appreciated Frank's concern, but she had learned long ago that running from trouble rarely solved anything. I'll be careful, I promise. But I won't hide. As they finished securing the saloon for the night, neither Maggie nor Frank noticed the three figures watching from the shadows across the street. Morrison, Pete, and Jake had not returned to their camp, as everyone assumed. Instead, they had been drinking at a smaller, seedier establishment on the outskirts of town, nursing their wounded pride and planning their revenge. That fancy man made us look like fools, Morrison growled, taking another swig from a bottle of cheap whiskey. We can't let it stand, Pete agreed. Word gets around about something like this, and we'll never live it down. Jake was the most practical of the three. But if he's really Thomas Whitmore, we can't just go after him directly. He's got too much power. I'm not talking about going after him, Morrison said with a cruel smile. I'm talking about going after what he was protecting. That saloon girl thinks she's too good for the likes of us. Maybe it's time someone taught her different. But if she's really under his protection, how's he going to protect her if he doesn't know what's happening? Morrison asked. Accidents happen all the time in frontier towns. People disappear. Sometimes they're found days later. Sometimes they're never found at all. The three men continued drinking and planning as the night grew darker. They had no intention of leaving with the cattle drive in the morning. They had unfinished business in Copper Creek, and they were determined to settle the score, regardless of the consequences. Meanwhile, in his room at the hotel, Thomas Whitmore stood by his window looking out at the quiet main street. He had a clear view of the Silver Dollar Saloon, and he was thinking about the evening's events. His intervention had been successful in the immediate term, but he knew from experience that men like Morrison rarely accepted defeat gracefully. He would need to keep a close watch on the situation. Whitmore had not been entirely truthful about his reasons for being in Copper Creek. While he was indeed considering business opportunities in the area, his primary purpose was more personal. He was tracking someone, a man who had wronged his family in a way that demanded justice. His sources had indicated that this man might be hiding somewhere in the region, possibly using an assumed name. The investigation had brought him to Copper Creek, where he planned to stay for several weeks while he gathered information. His encounter with Maggie O'Brien had been unexpected, but something about her had immediately captured his attention. Perhaps it was her courage in the face of intimidation, or perhaps it was something deeper that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. One thing was certain, he had meant what he said about protection. If Morrison or his friends tried to harm Maggie, they would discover that Thomas Whitmore's reputation for ruthlessness was well-earned. As midnight approached, the town of Copper Creek settled into an uneasy quiet. Most residents slept peacefully, unaware of the undercurrents of tension that would soon boil over into violence. The confrontation at the Silver Dollar had set events in motion that would change several lives forever, though none of the participants could yet imagine how dramatically their fates had become intertwined.